This week in Washington, the 75th anniversary of the NATO alliance will coincide with the summit bringing together America's allies, with wars raging both in Europe and the Middle East. Beginning tomorrow, representatives from NATO's 32 allied nations will meet in our nation's capital, with the prospect of a second Trump term hanging overhead, looming like a big cloud on the horizon. Now, for another year, the war in Ukraine is likely to dominate discussions as the conflict grinds through its third summer. Joining us now is former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He is the Chief International Analyst for NBC News. Admiral, thank you so much. Can you tell us about what we can expect to come out of this week and what it might mean for the future of Ukraine?
There'll be a feeling around NATO, clearly, that job one is Ukraine. So I suspect over half of all the conversations will be about how the alliance, operating together, moving logistics forward, providing intelligence, getting above all the weapon systems in the hands of the Ukrainians. Ukraine, job one. And then a subset of that, Sam, is going to be when, I would say when, not if, but when Ukraine can become a full member of NATO. I think that's what will really dominate these conversations. And by the way, it's the 75th anniversary of this venerable alliance. There's still a lot to celebrate about NATO.
And Admiral, we're getting some new images and pictures of a hospital being struck in Kyiv. I'm just sort of curious if you can give us a sense of what is going on in the capital of the country. Obviously, this is a dynamic situation. Maybe put it in a larger context of the current state of the war.
Yeah, let's do the micro first. What you're seeing on that screen is called a war crime. This is when a targeting occurs that is directed against a civilian population, and in particular against hospitals, electric plants, waterworks, the children's schools, clinics that are struck. So this is a continuing pattern for Vladimir Putin. What he's trying to do is, as he's been trying to do for over 2 years, and he won't succeed, is breaking the will of the Ukrainian people. In terms of how it's going on the battlefield, again, this is the conversation that the NATO summit will dive into with its 32 members. How it's going is it's still a stalemate, but as those weapon systems flow forward, I think you'll see the Ukrainians certainly be able to hold off the Russians despite these kind of terror attacks. And hey, bottom line, back to NATO for a minute, this is 32 nations, well over 50% of the world's gross domestic product. It's a powerful alliance. It dwarfs Russia. And I think ultimately NATO backing to Ukraine will help the Ukrainians prevail in this conflict.
This was already a massive and important summit in its own right, but it's now coming in the backdrop of a few major political developments. I think key among them, the elections in France that just transpired yesterday, the elections in the UK, which were a few days ago, but of course, the debate performance from Joe Biden, which has raised real concerns among international leaders about the future of U.S. leadership and the possibility of Donald Trump returning to power. Obviously, Trump is a fairly robust NATO critic. Can you talk about this sort of milieu of political developments that are happening in advance of the summit and what it means for the conversations that will take place in D.C. this week?
Sure. Let's put them in three baskets. Certainly, all eyes will be on President Biden. All of the leaders, this is a summit. All of his peers are coming, the leaders of every one of these 32 nations. They're all going to be observing the president very closely, looking for clues about his well-being, the same conversations and debates that we're having here in the United States. Bucket two, you mentioned, and it's the elections in Europe. And the one in the UK, not so much a big change. Labour is very supportive of NATO, quite supportive of Ukraine overall. The election in France, a different kettle of fish. Here you've got a real split. They would call it a hung parliament, real disagreements between the Élysée, the presidential palace, and the parliament itself. So a good bit of back and forth in the French body politic that weakens NATO, and that will be certainly a subtext. People will be looking for President Macron to show that he still is in control of events in France and such a big part of Europe. And then finally, the third basket, I think, is the return of Donald Trump. That will be a lively topic of conversation. People will say things like, what should we do? How should we prepare? In one word, the Europeans should be prepared to spend more to get their defense spending up to 2% minimum, hopefully up to 2.5%. That should quiet some of the discord potentially coming from a Trump administration. Those are the three baskets, Sam.
Always breaking it down so eloquently for us. Thank you very much. Retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis.